Imagine someone, like, walks down a dark hallway,
Yeah.
unlocks the heavy iron door to your jail cell, and just swings it wide open.
Okay.
And they look at you and say, you're totally free to go. The world is yours.
Right. The ultimate dream.
Exactly. But instead of walking out to the sunlight, you immediately look at the warden and ask for a new set of rules.
Wow.
You ask for a new schedule. In fact, you ask to be locked in a different, maybe slightly nicer cell.
That sounds completely insane when you frame it like that.
I know, right? Because we all say we want freedom. We celebrate autonomy. We fight for independence. We hold up the individual as this ultimate ideal in our society.
We do, but the reality is much darker.
Yeah, because history, sociology, and just a massive mountain of psychological data show us that when we actually get that freedom, we're often utterly terrified by it.
Oh, absolutely terrified.
And almost immediately we start looking around for someone or something to surrender it to.
It really is the great glaring contradiction of the modern human condition. I mean, we want the cage door open, we demand that it be opened, but the very moment we step outside.
The sheer vastness of it all.
Yes, the vastness of the sky sends us running right back inside, just desperately looking for a new zookeeper to tell us what to do and who to be.
And that bizarre, deeply ingrained psychological reflex is exactly what we are exploring today for you, the listener.
We have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We have a massive stack of sources on the table for this deep dive. We're pulling from deep sociology, clinical psychology, and modern organizational behavior.
So we're starting way back, right?
Yeah, we're diving into foundational texts from Erich Fromm, Theodor Adorno, and the Frankfurt School.
The heavy hitters.
Right. And then we'll be walking through those infamous laboratory studies on human obedience before bringing it right into the present day.
To look at modern business critiques.
Exactly. Things like transformational leadership, corporate cults, and something called the hero trap.
Which is fascinating. And the overarching mission here really is to uncover the hidden psychological architecture of why we are so incredibly eager to surrender our agency.
Why do we want to give it away?
Right. Like, why do we actively seek out authority figures to make our decisions for us? And that spans everything from demagogic politicians to celebrity CEOs and now even artificial intelligence systems.
Oh, the AI angle's huge.
It is. But more importantly, the goal of this deep dive is to understand how we can recognize this trap in our own daily lives so we can actually escape it and reclaim genuine functional autonomy.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because before we can point fingers and look at who we surrender our power to, we have to deeply understand the existential anxiety that makes us want to surrender it in the first place.
The root cause.
Exactly. Why is freedom scary? And to answer that, our sources point us directly to Erich Fromm's framework on the burden of autonomy. So let's talk about Fromm and why he was looking into this.
Yeah, so Erich Fromm was this brilliant psychoanalyst and sociologist. He was associated with the Frankfurt School. And he wrote this landmark, incredibly influential book in 1941 called Escape from Freedom.
1941. That date is critical.
Extremely critical. I mean, Fromm was a German Jewish intellectual who had fled the rise of the Nazi regime.
Right.
He was sitting there watching the supposed pinnacle of civilized, educated European society just willingly hand over their minds and their nation to totalitarianism.
And he didn't buy the standard explanations.
No, he wasn't satisfied with the answer that people were just, like, tricked or forced. He wanted to know what inside the human psyche actually craved that submission.
He was looking for the vulnerability.
Precisely. And Fromm argued that to understand this modern anxiety, you have to zoom way back. You have to look at the transition from the medieval world to the modern world.
Okay, set the scene for the medieval era.
So, in the medieval era, human beings were severely restricted in ways we can barely even comprehend today. You were born into a specific, rigid class.
No, moving up the ladder.
Nope. You are likely tied to a specific feudal manor. Your entire conceptual universe was strictly governed by the church.
Wow.
Yeah. Your profession was predetermined by your father's profession. Your life was just laid out for you from the cradle to the grave.
I'm trying to imagine that. Like, you had no geographic mobility, no social mobility, and honestly, no intellectual mobility.
None. But, and this is the crucial pivot in Fromm's theory, because of those severe restrictions, you possess something modern people desperately lack:
Which is,
absolute ontological security.
hold on, let's slow down on ontological security. That's a pretty heavy academic term. You mean they literally didn't have to question the meaning of their own existence?
Exactly that. I mean, ontology is the study of being. So ontological security means you are deeply fundamentally secure in your identity and your place in the universe.
Okay, I get it.
A medieval serf might have had a physically grueling life, but they never woke up at 3 a.m. sweating, wondering, what is my personal brand? Am I maximizing my potential?
What is my purpose?
Right. They knew exactly who they were, where they belonged in the community, and what their purpose was in this grand, divinely ordained cosmic order. They were inextricably linked to the world around them.
So you were heavily limited, but you were never ever alone.
That is the perfect summary. But then obviously, the world changes.
Right, the Renaissance, the Reformation.
Exactly. The Protestant Reformation, eventually the massive gears of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of capitalism. These historical forces completely shattered that medieval dome.
The rigid hierarchies just broke down.
They did, and this resulted in what Fromm calls freedom from, or negative freedom.
Negative freedom. That sounds like an oxymoron to me. How on earth is freedom negative?
Well, it's negative in the sense of subtraction. Individuals were emancipated, subtracted from external constraints and traditional authorities.
Oh, I see.
You were no longer bound to the manor or the guild. You could go to a city, choose a profession, choose a religion. But the psychological cost of this sudden liberation was just massive. People became atomized.
Atomized, meaning like broken down into single floating particles.
Right. They were suddenly isolated, completely separated from the collective whole that used to define them. They were thrust into this vast, competitive, and deeply indifferent market economy.
That sounds overwhelming.
It is. You are now entirely responsible for your own survival, your own success, and your own identity.
You know, I have an analogy for this that might make it a bit more visceral.
Oh, let's hear it.
Imagine an infant who has just, for the very first time, realized that they are physically separate from their mother.
Okay, yeah.
Up until that developmental milestone, the infant thinks they and the mother are one single entity. Then suddenly the brain develops enough to realize, wait, she is over there and I am over here.
That's a terrifying realization.
It really is the sudden, terrifying realization of physical vulnerability.
Right.
You are untethered. You are a separate, tiny being in a massive world you do not control. That is essentially what negative freedom feels like on a societal historical scale, isn't it?
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. It is the trauma of individuation. The umbilical cord to the old, secure world has just been cut.
So what's the alternative?
Well, Fromm states that the ideal state we should strive for after the separation is what he calls freedom to, or positive freedom.
So negative freedom is freedom from constraint, and positive freedom is freedom to do what?
Freedom to realize your own individual potential. Positive freedom is characterized by spontaneous, creative self-expression.
That sounds nice.
It is. It's the ability to have genuine, voluntary, loving connections with other people without losing your own identity. It's being a fully realized, independent adult who can navigate the world without a safety net.
But getting there can't be easy.
Reaching a state where you are completely secure in your own isolated individuality, that is incredibly hard work. It requires immense emotional maturity, critical thinking, and courage.
Right. So because reaching positive freedom is so daunting and sitting in negative freedom is so terrifying and anxiety-inducing, we look for a shortcut.
We absolutely do.
We can't bear the weight of being a solitary atom in the universe, so we employ psychological survival strategies to numb the pain. And Fromm calls these escape mechanisms, right?
He does. To avoid the crushing existential anxiety of isolation, humans desperately try to dissolve their isolated selves into larger, more powerful entities.
They want to merge.
Yeah, they want to blur the boundary between themselves and the world so they don't have to feel alone anymore. And Fromm identifies 3 primary mechanisms we use to escape. The first one he outlines is authoritarianism.
Break that down for us, because usually when we hear authoritarianism, we think of like a dictator on a balcony. But Fromm is talking about an internal psychological mechanism, right?
Yes, he's talking about a character orientation.
Yeah.
The authoritarian escape mechanism is this twisted dynamic of both sadism and masochism.
Okay, how so?
The individual seeks to control others, that's the sadistic impulse, in order to impose a rigid order on their chaotic world and make others dependent on them.
But where does the masochism come in?
Simultaneously, they deeply desire to submit to a higher power, the masochistic impulse. so they can completely shed the terrible burden of their own selfhood and decision-making.
Wow. So it's a chain of command as a coping mechanism.
Exactly.
I brutally control the people below me, but I completely and willingly bow down to the person above me. It's a rigid hierarchy of coping. If I'm just a cog in a strict machine, I don't have to figure out my own purpose. The machine gives me my purpose.
You nailed it. You surrender your freedom to the system. Now, the second mechanism from identifies is destructiveness.
Okay, what's that?
Unlike the authoritarian who wants to control others and keep them around, the destructive personality simply wants to eliminate anything and anyone they cannot bring under their influence.
But how does destroying things cure the anxiety of isolation? That seems totally counterintuitive.
It's a response to feeling completely overwhelmed and powerless in a competitive, free environment where they feel they don't belong and just can't succeed.
Oh, I see.
If the world makes you feel small, weak, and isolated, the destructive impulse says, if I destroy the world around me, it can no longer crush me. It is a dark, desperate attempt to protect the fragile self by eliminating all external threats.
So if they can't fit into the complex world, they just want to burn it down to something simple.
Yes.
That feels incredibly relevant to a lot of modern behavior, honestly. Like the psychology of an internet troll or certain types of radicalized extremism.
Yeah.
It's not about building a new system. It's just about tearing down the one that makes you feel inadequate.
It is very relevant today. But the third escape mechanism, which From and our modern sources note is by far the most common in modern democratic capitalist societies, is automaton conformity.
Automaton, so like a robot.
Yes, automaton conformity is when an individual unconsciously adopts the societal norms, the beliefs, the tastes, and the behaviors of the culture around them so completely that they blend in entirely.
Just vanish into the crowd.
Exactly. The boundary between the self and the world disappears, but not in a healthy way. They stop being a unique individual and become what the sources call a consumeristic follower.
So instead of submitting to a dictator, I submit to the algorithm, the advertising, the trend cycle.
Precisely. You let the culture industry, the advice of pundits, the trends on social media dictate your choices. You wear what everyone else wears. You hold the political opinions that your specific demographic is supposed to hold.
You avoid the anxiety of genuine free thinking by simply downloading your personality from the surrounding culture.
Beautifully put. You are no longer alone because you are exactly like everyone else, but you've lost your freedom in the process.
Okay, so this broad societal anxiety, this terror of negative freedom, creates a desperate need to escape. But how does that broad historical trend actually rewire a specific individual's personality?
That's the key question.
It is the perfect pivot. Let's move from the societal to the deeply personal, because this cultural anxiety creates the perfect breeding ground for a very specific and frankly dangerous psychological profile.
This is where we turn to another foundational text in our stack. We are looking at Theodor Adorno and his colleagues from the Frankfurt School.
Specifically, their massive 1950 work, right?
Yes, their highly influential book called The Authoritarian Personality.
Let's set the stage for 1950. The ashes of World War II are barely cold. The Holocaust has been exposed to the world, and intellectuals are just reeling.
They were utterly shell-shocked. Adorno and his team wanted to understand how ostensibly civilized, highly educated, culturally rich societies like Germany in the 1920s and 30s could so enthusiastically embrace extreme fascism.
It couldn't just be a fluke.
Right. They theorized that it couldn't just be an accident of history. They weren't just looking for conscious, stated political beliefs.
They wanted what was underneath.
Yes, they were hunting for underlying pre-political personality traits. They wanted to know if there was a specific psychological type that was fundamentally primed to accept a dictator. To measure this, they developed something called the F scale.
The F stands for fascism, right?
Yes, the Fascism Scale.
I have the breakdown of this scale from the sources, and it measures an individual's latent susceptibility to falling for a demagogue. It breaks down into 9 different dimensions of personality.
Let's walk through them.
I really want us to take our time with these because looking at them clustered together is fascinating and honestly, sometimes a bit confusing.
I'll give you the first 3, which form the core cluster. First is conventionalism. This is defined as a rigid, unbending adherence to traditional middle-class values.
Okay, what's next?
Second is authoritarian submission. This is an uncritical, almost blind attitude of submissiveness toward the idealized moral authorities of their specific in-group.
And the third.
Third, which is inextricably linked to the previous 2, is authoritarian aggression. This is a tendency to be constantly on the lookout for and a strong desire to harshly punish anyone who violates those conventional values.
So grouping those three, I rigorously follow the traditional rules, I totally submit to the leaders who preach those rules, and I actively want to hurt anyone who breaks those rules.
Okay.
That makes sense. That's the classic bully dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
But the next one on the scale is where I start to get a little confused. The fourth dimension is anti-introception. What does that even mean?
So introception refers to introspection, imagination, or subjectivity. So anti-introception is a complete and visceral rejection of the internal life.
Rejection of the internal life.
Right. The authoritarian personality hates what Adorno called the tender-minded. They hate philosophy, they hate abstract art, they despise deep psychological self-reflection.
But why? Why would a rejection of imagination be a key pillar of fascism?
Think back to Fromm's theory of anxiety. Introspection requires you to look inward. And if you look inward, you have to confront that terrifying, swirling vortex of negative freedom and existential anxiety we just discussed.
Oh, wow.
You might find doubts, you might find ambiguity. The authoritarian mind literally cannot tolerate ambiguity. They need the world to be solid, external, and objective.
So they aggressively reject anyone or anything that suggests reality is subjective or complex.
Precisely.
That is fascinating. It's basically a defense mechanism against their own internal dread. Okay, moving down the list. The fifth dimension is superstition and stereotypy. The stereotypy part makes sense, like thinking in rigid black and white categories to save mental energy.
Right.
But superstition, I'm struggling with that part. Aren't dictators usually obsessed with rigid order and cold, hard strengths, not, magic or astrology?
It seems contradictory, I know, but it links directly back to that inability to handle complexity.
How so?
If you cannot tolerate the ambiguity of how the world actually works, if you can't handle the fact that economic downturns are caused by complex, overlapping global supply chains and fiscal policies, you need a simpler explanation.
And superstition provides that.
Yes, superstition is the belief in mystical determinants of fate. It shifts the locus of control entirely outside the self. If things go wrong, it's not a complex systemic failure. It's fate, or it's a shadowy magical force. It completely removes the burden of systemic, rational analysis.
I see. It's intellectual laziness born out of anxiety. Okay, the sixth trait is power and toughness. This is a total preoccupation with dominance and submission, a strong division of the world into the strong and the weak, and an exaggerated assertion of strength. They just have to project toughness constantly.
Yes, because to be weak in their worldview is to be a victim of the aggression they themselves feel. The seventh dimension is destructiveness and cynicism.
Meaning?
This is a generalized, baseline hostility toward humanity. They view human nature as fundamentally selfish and evil, which justifies their own aggressive impulses. It's a dog-eat-dog world, so I have to be the biggest dog.
The eighth is projectivity. This is the disposition to believe that wild, dangerous conspiracies are happening in the world, the belief that the world is inherently dangerous and full of secret plots.
Projectivity is a classic psychoanalytic term. You take your own dark, repressed impulses, your own desire to cheat, steal, or dominate, and you project them onto others.
I'm not the bad guy.
Yeah.
They are secretly plotting against me.
Exactly.
And then we get to the ninth dimension, and this one really threw me. Exaggerated concern with sexual goings-on.
Meaning an obsession with policing the private, intimate sexual behaviors of other people. Why is an obsession with other people's bedrooms a marker for falling for a dictator?
It comes back to control and repression. The authoritarian personality, according to Adorno's psychoanalytic framework, is deeply repressed.
Because they surrendered their positive freedom.
Right. Because they have surrendered their own spontaneous positive freedom, they have also usually repressed their own natural desires and impulses. When they see other people freely expressing intimacy or non-traditional sexual identities, it triggers immense anxiety and resentment. They want to crush that free expression because it reminds them of the freedom they have denied themselves.
Okay, looking at all 9 of these together, it's a terrifyingly coherent profile. But I have to ask the origin question. Where does this syndrome actually come from?
Adorno and his colleagues argued this is not innate. Right.
Right, there is no authoritarian gene.
No, absolutely not. They argued that it is historically and socially produced, and critically, it very often stems from early childhood dynamics. Our sources specifically point to harsh, punitive parenting models. Environments where a child is absolutely not allowed to express anger, frustration, or even their own will safely.
Yes. Adorno leaned heavily on Freudian concepts here. Imagine a child raised in an extremely traditional home by a stern, overbearing father who demands absolute, unquestioning obedience.
A recipe for resentment.
Naturally, the child is going to experience resentments or frustrations. That is a normal part of development. But because the punishment for expressing that frustration is so severe, maybe physical, maybe a tonal withdrawal of love, that anger cannot be expressed.
So what happens to it? Gets bottled up. But repressed anger doesn't just evaporate.
Exactly. It requires an outlet. It acts like a pressure cooker. So, through the psychological mechanism of displacement, that anger and hatred toward the terrifying father figure is repressed, and instead it is projected outward onto safe targets.
Like scapegoats.
Usually marginalized outgroups or anyone society deems weaker or unconventional.
Wow. So the subconscious logic is, I am terrified of the authority figure who controls me, and I cannot safely rebel against him. So I will submit to him, and I will take all the fury I feel about being dominated, and I will aim it at the people society tells me it's okay to hate.
It's a dark cycle.
I basically lick the boot above me, and I kick the face below me.
Precisely. And this intricate, tragic, psychological knot creates what Adorno calls the pseudo-conservative.
Let's define that term, because pseudo-conservative sounds like a paradox. How can you be a fake conservative?
It is a brilliant distinction Adorno makes. A traditional, genuine conservative, in Adorno's view, understands, respects, and genuinely wants to preserve established institutions, democratic norms, and class structures. They like stability.
But the pseudo-conservative.
The pseudo-conservative, however, only claims to defend these institutions. They use the language of tradition and patriotism. But deep down, because of that repressed childhood rage, they suffer from a failed identification with authority. They secretly resent the patriarch and the establishment.
So what do they actually want, if not stability?
Consequently, they actually want to destroy the very democratic structures and traditional institutions they claim to uphold. They are drawn to chaos. What they truly long for is the direct, unmediated, violent control by those they deem powerful. They are rebels, yes, but their rebellion is ultimately submissive to an absolute authority who promises to smash the system.
They don't want to conserve the republic.
No, they want a strong man to burn it down so they can watch their enemies suffer. What's fascinating here is how psychoanalytic defense mechanisms literally shape political landscapes.
Okay, I'm sitting here listening to this, and it makes complete conceptual sense. It's an elegant, airtight theory. But it is one thing to theorize this complex personality type sitting in an armchair in 1950. It is another entirely to observe it in the real world.
Sure.
I mean, I have a hard time accepting that you could just give someone a questionnaire and know if they are a latent authoritarian. Is there any actual physical proof that people who score high on this S scale will actually do terrible things? Did the scientific community test Adorno's work?
They absolutely tested it, and the results were chilling. This brings us to the laboratory proof. One of the most famous and infamous follow-ups was conducted by researchers Alan Elms and Stanley Milgram in 1966.
Okay, I think most people have at least a passing familiarity with Stanley Milgram's famous shock experiments at Yale. But let's paint the picture for anyone who hasn't heard of it.
It is a foundational study in psychology. Milgram brought average citizens into a laboratory. They were introduced to an experimenter wearing a gray lab coat, a clear symbol of authority.
Right, the lab coat is key.
Very key. The participant was seated in front of a massive, imposing shock generator with switches ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts labeled danger, severe shock.
Just reading words to another person.
Right. They were instructed by the experimenter in the lab coat to read word pairs to another person, a learner in the next room. If the learner got the answer wrong, the participant was ordered to flip a switch and deliver an electric shock, increasing the voltage every time.
And the horrifying twist is that the machine was fake and the learner in the next room was actually an actor.
Yes.
Pretending to scream in pain, eventually complaining of a heart condition, and then finally going completely terrifyingly silent.
Exactly. The experiment wasn't about memory, it was about obedience. Milgram wanted to see how far normal people would go in torturing a stranger simply because a guy in a lab coat politely but firmly told them, the experiment requires that you continue.
And the results were awful.
The horrifying result was that a massive percentage of everyday people went all the way to 450 volts, administering what they believed were lethal shocks.
It's the terrifying proof of the banality of evil.
Yeah.
But how does this connect back to Adorno and the F scale?
That is where Alan Elms comes in. Elms was Milgram's assistant. He wanted to look deeper into who obeyed and who defied the orders. So in 1966, Elms and Milgram took 40 participants from that shock experiment.
How did they divide them up?
20 who had fully obeyed the orders to the very end, and 20 who had rebelled, stood up, and refused to continue shocking the person. They administered Adorno's F scale to all 40 of them, and the results were striking.
Did it correlate?
The participants who obeyed the unethical orders scored significantly higher on the F scale than those who rebelled.
Wow, so those 9 dimensions, the conventionalism, the anti-interception, the superstition, those traits directly statistically correlated with a willingness to blindly torture a stranger just because authority demanded it.
Yes. Furthermore, during the in-depth interviews Elms conducted, the obedient participants assigned highly positive, almost glowing traits to the authority figure.
The guy in the lab coat.
Exactly. While assigning highly negative traits to the victim in the other room, viewing them as inferior or deserving of the shocks for being stupid.
Classic projection.
And tying it perfectly back to Adorno's psychoanalytic theory on childhood, the obedient participants demonstrated a distinct, measurable lack of emotional closeness with their fathers compared to the defiant group.
That feels like a massive, undeniable vindication for Adorno's theory. But I want to play devil's advocate here, looking through our stack of sources. Adorno's study wasn't perfect, was it?
No, it wasn't.
In fact, it received a lot of academic pushback over the decades. For one, his original sample size in the 1940s was highly ethnocentric. It was mostly white, middle-class Americans. But more importantly, there were major methodological flaws in how the F scale was actually written, right? Looking at something called acquiescence bias.
Yes, the academic critique of Adorno is crucial here. Acquiescence bias is a major flaw in survey design. It occurs when all the test questions or statements are worded in the exact same direction.
I see.
In the original F scale, all the statements you had to rate were worded positively toward authoritarianism.
Give me an example of what that means in practice.
For instance, a statement might be, obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. You rate how much you agree.
Sounds like a standard survey question.
The problem is, some people are just naturally agreeable. They have a psychological tendency to say yes or I agree to whatever statement a researcher puts in front of them, especially if it sounds somewhat plausible.
Oh, because it's easier.
Because every question on the F scale required an agree to score high on authoritarianism, if you were just a polite, agreeable person who tended to nod along with surveys, you would artificially score much higher as an authoritarian.
Ah, I see. A well-designed survey should flip the wording on half the questions to make sure you are actually reading and holding a consistent stance, not just blindly agreeing.
Exactly.
And the sources also mention social desirability bias, where people might lie on the survey to hide their true prejudices because they know it looks bad.
Exactly. But perhaps the biggest critique of Adorno wasn't methodological, it was political. Adorno's scale seemed to imply, both in its framing and its execution, that authoritarianism was strictly, exclusively a right-wing conservative phenomenon.
And looking at history, especially the 20th century, we know that totalitarianism can absolutely come from the left side of the political spectrum as well.
Precisely. And that is where the psychologist Milton Rokeach enters the picture in the late 1950s and 60s. Rokeach noticed something highly intriguing.
What was it?
He tested members of the U.S. Communist Party and other radical left-wing groups using Adorno's F scale. They scored very low. According to Adorno's metric, they were anti-authoritarian.
But in reality,
if you actually observe their behavior, their party structure, and their rhetoric, they were highly rigid, fiercely dogmatic, entirely intolerant of dissent, and they submitted entirely to the authority of the party apparatus.
they were textbook authoritarians. They just used a different vocabulary. They used the language of the working class instead of the language of the traditional fatherland.
Exactly. The psychological structure was identical, only the political content had changed. So Rokeach created his own metric, called the D scale, which stood for dogmatism.
To measure general closed-mindedness.
Yes, he wanted to prove that authoritarianism is not strictly tethered to one end of the political spectrum. It is an apolitical psychological state, a fundamental closed-mindedness, a cognitive rigidity, and a reliance on absolute authority that can exist on the extreme left just as easily as the extreme right.
Okay, so we've established that this personality type, this cognitive rigidity, exists. We've mapped it out. We've seen it tested in the lab. We've refined the scale. But this leads me to a massive question.
Lay it on me.
If this personality is just a latent set of traits, are some people just walking time bombs? or does the environment pull the trigger? Like, if you score super high on the F scale or the D scale, but you live in a peaceful, thriving, equitable society with no major crises,
Hmm.
do you ever become dangerous?
That is the multi-million-dollar question, and the answer is the crucial pivot of this entire deep dive.
So does it.
The environment absolutely pulls the trigger. The authoritarian personality isn't just a static psychological defect that inevitably leads to fascism. It is a latent potential. It is a vulnerability that is actively cultivated, manipulated, and weaponized by specific environments and specific cultural forces.
So it's like having a genetic predisposition for a disease, but you only actually get sick if you are exposed to a specific toxic environment. So how does modern society actually manufacture that toxic environment? Let's look at how culture actively pulls this trigger.
To answer that, we have to look at another foundational concept developed by Theodor Adorno and his colleague Max Horkheimer, the culture industry. They outline this in their deeply pessimistic but fascinating book, Dialectic of Enlightenment.
Right. Remember, they were living in America by this point.
Yes, watching the rise of mass media, Hollywood, and consumer culture in the 1940s.
They escaped the Nazis and landed in the middle of American consumerism.
And they were highly critical of what they saw. They observed that monopoly capitalism transforms culture, art, music, film, news, literature into homogeneous, standardized commodities.
Meaning everything starts looking the same.
Yes. The goal of the culture industry isn't to enlighten you or challenge your worldview or provoke deep reflection. The singular goal is to generate reliable profit.
Right.
And to do that at a mass scale, it appeals to the lowest common denominator. It dumbs down complex socioeconomic issues into easily digestible narratives, and in doing so, it creates a mass society that is fundamentally incapable of handling cognitive ambiguity.
I have a modern analogy for this that I think perfectly maps onto Adorno and Horkheimer's fears. Think about modern social media algorithms, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook.
Oh, absolutely.
They are the ultimate hyper-evolved form of the culture industry. They intentionally feed us a curated diet of conjugal outrage and incredibly simplistic black and white answers. Why? Because nuanced truth, deep context, and ambiguity do not drive user engagement.
No, they don't.
Conflict, fear, and validation drive engagement. The algorithm literally trains our brains, minute by minute, to reject anything that challenges our pre-existing worldview. It demands that we pick a side and stay there.
That is a highly accurate, very troubling comparison. By conditioning people to expect simple, binary answers, good guy versus bad guy, winner versus loser, the culture industry slowly removes our cognitive capacity to tolerate the messy, highly ambiguous reality of actual life.
And reality is always messy.
Exactly. And when reality inevitably intrudes, say, during a massive economic crisis, a pandemic, or a period of rapid, disorienting social and demographic upheaval, people experience severe psychological stress. Their simple worldview is completely shattered.
And what happens to the latent authoritarian personality when it is injected with that kind of societal stress?
It flares up violently. Stress activation is a very real, measurable phenomenon. When individuals feel threatened, either realistically threatened, like losing their job or their pension, or symbolically threatened, like feeling their cultural values and status are being erased, they psychologically regress.
They go backward.
They desperately seek what the Frankfurt School called an father.
A primal father figure.
Yes, a strong, unyielding, unapologetic leader who will promise to sweep away all the terrifying ambiguity and provide rigid, absolute, simple answers. I alone can fix it.
Right.
Furthermore, under this stress, these groups engage in what sociologists call negative integration.
Let's unpack negative integration.
Normally, a healthy group integrates around shared positive values. We come together because we all believe in democracy or we all love this specific art form. Negative integration is when you define your in-group strictly by who you hate. You don't actually have a coherent internal philosophy.
I might not know exactly what we stand for, what our policy platform is, or what our moral core is, but I know for an absolute, undeniable fact that we are unconditionally not them.
Exactly. It creates a powerful, fiercely unified group identity without requiring any positive shared values or complex thought. It only requires a shared enemy.
Now, looking at our sources, we have a very important note to share with you, the listener.
Yeah.
If we look at the text we're synthesizing today, and I want to be super clear with you, we are just mapping out the analysis these specific sociologists and historians provide in the reading material.
Right.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints, taking a political stance, or making political judgments ourselves, But it is vital to the deep dive to report that these authors explicitly connect this psychology of stress, negative integration, and the search for an Ur-father directly to modern and historical politics.
Yes, to provide the full picture of the source material, the texts explicitly cite Donald Trump's 2016 campaign rhetoric and the rise of the alt-right movement as modern textbook manifestations of these exact authoritarian dynamics.
Especially the negative integration.
Specifically, the use of negative integration and the appeal to simplistic strongman solutions during times of perceived cultural stress.
And the sources don't just point to recent events. They contextualize it by citing historical examples on the American political right as well, comparing these modern tactics to the anti-communist paranoia of McCarthyism, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the massive popularity of the 1930s radio agitator Father Coughlin.
Who used the new mass media of radio to stoke immense resentment and point it at scapegoats.
Exactly. Again, we are simply reporting the through line the academic authors have drawn from Adorno's theories to these specific political movements. The core takeaway from the literature is that the psychological machinery of submission is never dormant.
It's always running in the background.
It is constantly interacting with the media we consume and the economic stress we feel. But here is where we take a fascinating turn. Because this longing for a powerful savior, this desire to offload our anxiety onto a strong man, it doesn't just happen at the ballot box.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't just happen in national politics. It happens every single day in relatively mundane environments. It happens sitting right in your office chair.
It really does.
The workplace is a massive psychological battleground for this. Let's look at the hero trap in modern corporate culture.
I am so glad we are moving to this because the workplace is a fascinating, highly concentrated microcosm of these exact same dynamics. The human desire for a father figure to absorb our existential anxiety translates flawlessly into the corporate longing for a savior CEO.
One of the business critiques in our stack defines this phenomenon as the hero trap. And the author actually provides a mathematical equation for how it happens.
Let's hear it.
Power plus time plus applause minus accountability equals the hero trap. It describes how a business leader who starts off as genuinely necessary, talented, and effective gradually morph into an unquestionable, almost divine deity within the company.
It almost always starts innocently, even positively. A leader steps in during a period of corporate crisis. The company is losing money, morale is low. The leader makes a bold, risky decision, and it works.
You save the day.
They save the quarter. They get applause from the board and the employees. Over time, as they succeed, that continuous applause acts as a thick layer of insulation against criticism. As their informal power grows and their actual accountability shrinks, a dangerous shift occurs.
What kind of shift?
Any dissenting voice, any critical question from a subordinate isn't seen as helpful feedback or risk management. It is treated as heresy against the savior.
Okay, let me push back on this critique. Because if you read Forbes or Harvard Business Review, or if you go to any business school, they idolize the charismatic founder.
They do.
The turnaround CEO. Business schools literally teach something called transformational leadership as the absolute gold standard of management. Aren't visionary, bold leaders exactly what stagnant companies need?
They often do need a vision, yes. But the critical sources in our stack are aiming directly at the severe dark side of transformational leadership. While the theory sounds inspiring, a leader who transforms the vision and elevates the staff in actual practice, it often yields toxic results.
How so?
The sources argue that it encourages rampant, unchecked narcissism in the leader. And critically, on the flip side, it completely infantilizes the followers.
Infantilizes them.
Gao. By treating the leader as a charismatic physician or savior, who alone has the cure for the company's ills, the employees are reduced to dependent subjects. They pass all the cognitive responsibility and risk up to the boss.
So they stop thinking for themselves.
Right. I don't need to worry about the ethics or the long-term viability of this project. Steve Jobs or whoever says it's brilliant, so it must be. It shifts the dynamic from a team of autonomous, critical thinking adults solving complex problems together into a one-way process of domination, where the followers just wait passively to be told what the genius wants them to do.
So it's basically corporate authoritarian submission. I am giving up my professional positive freedom to dissolve into the aura of the powerful CEO.
Exactly. And the sources provide stark, catastrophic case studies of what happens when this psychology takes over a company. The classic, tragic example is Enron.
Walk us through Enron through this psychological lens.
Enron operated essentially like a corporate cult. It demanded pathological conformity to the brilliant, aggressive vision of its leaders, namely Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling. Skilling was viewed as the ultimate visionary, and they enforced this submission not with physical violence, but through a brutal corporate structure called the rank and yank performance system.
Rank and yank. That sounds like a nightmare. What
Oh.
was it?
Every year, employees were graded on a curve. No matter how well the team did as a whole, the bottom 10 or 15% of employees were fired yanked.
That's brutal.
This created an atmosphere of absolute terror and hyper-competitiveness. But crucially, your ranking was highly subjective, largely based on how well you aligned with the executive's vision.
Ah, so it was a loyalty test.
Yes, it actively purged anyone who asked difficult questions, anyone who pointed out accounting irregularities, anyone who didn't fit the mold of the true believer. It was a culture that systematically eradicated any capacity for critical dissent, leading to one of the most massive and destructive corporate frauds in history.
The sources also point to a more widespread example, the 2008 global banking crisis. You had Wall Street executives holding completely unchecked power, surrounded by what the sociologists in the text call evidence-resistant groupthink.
Groupthink is the social mechanism of reality denial. It's what happens when maintaining the harmony and the hierarchy of the group becomes more important than accurately assessing reality. In these toxic environments, people engage in what the author calls mutually assured delusion, or MAD.
Mutually assured delusion. That is a brilliant, terrifying phrase.
It is. Subordinates look at the leader pushing an incredibly risky, obviously flawed strategy, like bundling subprime mortgages. The subordinate realizes that their own status, their bonus, and their mortgage payment depend entirely on agreeing with the leader's genius.
So they just play along.
And so they consciously, or often unconsciously, choose denial. They convince themselves the math makes sense because it's too terrifying to admit the emperor has no clothes.
One of the authors in our stack refers to this specific corporate environment as pathological niceness, or Prozac leadership.
Prozac leadership. Wow.
The organization becomes absolutely obsessed with maintaining a smooth, positive, harmonious narrative about the leader's strategy. They actively silence any negative feedback, any red flags, to protect the illusion that everything is fine. It's a collective anesthesia.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of organizational health, we see that treating a CEO like a savior actually makes the company fundamentally structurally fragile.
How so?
When all the agency, all the critical decision-making, and all the truth are localized in one single hero, the rest of the organization's critical muscles atrophy. If that hero makes a mistake, and because they are human, they will, or if that hero leaves, the entire structure collapses because no one else knows how to think.
Which brings us to a really eerie, highly modern evolution of this entire concept of submission. Because the human drive to escape the burden of choice accountability is so overwhelming, we are now outsourcing our agency not just to human heroes, not just to CEOs or politicians, but to machines.
Yes, we are.
We are witnessing the ultimate surrender, the pivot to artificial intelligence, and the future of human agency.
This is perhaps the most contemporary, stealthy manifestation of Eric Fromm's escape from freedom. We are currently living through a transition from the human father figure to the algorithmic surrogate.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly, a bit scary.
Yeah.
Why are we so incredibly willing to hand over our lives, our workflows, and our decisions to an AI? The sources point to a concept called the convenience of compliance.
We have to acknowledge that making decisions, true autonomous decisions where you bear the weight of the consequences, is exhausting. It induces anxiety.
Right. Decision fatigue.
Decision fatigue is real. The research in our SAC notes that people actually find it significantly easier to surrender their will to an interactive AI system than to human advisors.
But why is that? Why trust a machine over a mentor?
Because the AI provides incredibly concrete, confident alternatives. It presents a structured, friction-free output. When you use an AI workflow, it creates an illusion of control. You are typing in the prompt, you feel like you're driving the process, you feel like the master.
But are you?
In reality, you are trapping yourself in an opaque, predetermined workflow designed by a black box machine. You are accepting its parameters of reality.
It's like, imagine you are driving your car in a new city. Your GPS clearly tells you to turn right. You look to your right, and there is literally a lake. There's no road.
Right.
But instead of trusting your own eyes, stopping the car, pulling out a map, and bearing the anxiety of navigating yourself out of being lost, you simply turn the wheel and drive straight into the water. We would rather be objectively, catastrophically wrong while following an automated system than bear the cognitive burden of autonomy.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and it perfectly highlights the immense systemic danger here. In massive organizations, in healthcare, in finance, in criminal justice, we are steadily replacing human discipline, human empathy, and human judgment with black box algorithms.
It's everywhere.
This creates a brand new, highly resilient hero trap. But this time, the hero isn't a charismatic CEO who can eventually be fired. It's a proprietary software model.
And if something goes wrong, if the algorithm denies someone a loan based on biased data or misdiagnoses a patient who is accountable, who gets fired?
No one. And that is the entire point. That is the dark allure of the system. The ultimate escape from freedom is escaping accountability.
That is chilling.
When algorithms make the crucial decisions, human governance phrase, no individual human is responsible, which means the system can become quietly, systemically destructive without anyone ever raising a red flag because everyone assumes the machine knows best.
Okay, let's take a breath. This has been a deeply challenging, somewhat dark journey.
It has been.
We've gone from the existential anxiety of being alone in the universe, to the formation of authoritarian personalities, to the nightmare of corporate cults, and finally, to handing over our minds to AI overlords.
Sounds pretty bleak.
If our underlying psychology, our media ecosystem, our corporate workplaces, and our technology are all pushing us toward this terrified submission, how do we fight back? Are we just doomed to be automatons? Let's talk about escaping the trap and actually reclaiming our autonomy.
We are not doomed. The sources do offer concrete, actionable solutions to counteract this psychology. The first set of solutions is psychological, and it relies on a framework called self-determination theory, or SDT.
Okay, SDT.
SDT acts as the direct psychological antidote to authoritarian environments. It posits that humans have three basic, non-negotiable psychological needs that must be met in order to function optimally and resist the urge to submit. These are autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Let's define those in everyday terms.
Autonomy is the feeling that you have a meaningful choice in your actions, that you are the author of your own life. Competence is the feeling that you are capable, skilled, and effective at what you do. And relatedness is the feeling of being genuinely connected to and cared for by other people.
So feeling like you have a choice, feeling like you are good at what you do, and feeling like you belong to a community.
Exactly. And to foster this in a workplace or a society, leaders must completely abandon the hero model. They must adopt an autonomy-supportive tone.
What does that look like?
Instead of dictating reality and demanding blind compliance, they must actively acknowledge the perspectives of their team. They must provide clear, rational explanations for why a task needs to be done, rather than just saying, because I said so. And they must encourage self-initiation.
So it cures the anxiety.
Yes, when people feel competent and connected, the existential stress that triggers the authoritarian reflex is neutralized.
That handles the interpersonal psychology. But what about at a structural level? How do you actually build a massive organization or a company that is structurally immune to the hero trap?
That's where we look to the military.
Right, the sources point to something called the defense model of organizational resilience. And I found this fascinating because the military builds its systems on the fundamental structural assumption that no one is indispensable, not even the five-star general.
It is a profound shift in mindset, especially compared to the corporate worship of the CEO. If you structurally assume that no one is indispensable, you make it impossible to build a cult of personality.
How do they actually do that?
The military achieves this resilience through several very specific mechanisms. First is mandatory officer rotation.
Explain how that prevents the trap.
Leaders change posts frequently, usually every few years. This deliberately prevents any single individual from becoming an entrenched, unquestionable deity in one specific department. It breaks the time variable in the hero trap equation.
So loyalty stays with the mission.
Exactly. The loyalty remains to the mission and the institution, not to the specific commander.
Second is concise continuity materials. In the corporate world, you often have that one guy in IT who's the only person on Earth who knows how the legacy servers work. That gives him massive unchecked power. The military doesn't allow that. Knowledge is standardized, documented, and shared.
Exactly. The system must survive the sudden loss of any individual. Third is role-based access. There is clear ownership, transparent audit trails, and defined authorities. Processes don't rely on informal, hidden favors or the personal whims of a manager. The rules apply to everyone equally.
And the final one,
And finally, and perhaps most importantly, scenario rehearsal.
they practice losing.
They literally practice what to do if key personnel are suddenly lost or incapacitated. They run war games. They actively stress test the organization's ability to survive and function without its heroes. This creates a culture of supreme competence across the board, rather than reliance on a savior.
And stepping outside the military or corporate boardroom, there is also a profound sociological hope hidden right there in Adorno's original 1950 work on the F scale, right?
Right.
A clue to how normal people fight this.
Yeah.
The sources talk about the middle scorers.
Yes, this is a beautiful point of optimism. Adorno and his colleagues noted that society isn't just divided into high-scoring, hardcore authoritarians and fully realized, perfectly free individuals. Most people exist in the messy middle.
So they aren't lost causes.
Right. They are susceptible to the anxiety, but they aren't fully radicalized. The researchers found immense hope when they studied progressive labor unions of that era, specifically the United Electrical Workers, the UE, and the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the ILWU.
Why those specific unions? What were they doing right?
Because these institutions provided genuine structural solidarity, they didn't just negotiate wages, they hammered home anti-hierarchical worldviews on a daily basis. They ran education programs, they taught workers that the boss wasn't a god, they gave workers a profound sense of relatedness and competence linking right back to self-determination theory. They showed that you could be part of a powerful collective, you could cure your isolation without having to submit to a dictator.
Wow.
It proved that creating democratic institutions of solidarity can literally keep the fascist tendencies in human nature dormant.
This raises an important question about our own lives as listeners. How do we structure our daily routines? How do we curate our media consumption? How do we act in our workplaces to actively foster that kind of genuine critical thinking and solidarity rather than passively slipping into automaton conformity?
It requires immense daily vigilance. Autonomy is not a passive state of being, it is a muscle. It is an active daily practice of questioning your own assumptions, tolerating ambiguity, and resisting the powerful, comfortable urge to let a politician, a CEO, or an algorithm do the heavy lifting of your life.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've covered a massive, sprawling amount of ground together today.
We really have.
We started by looking at the historical terror of negative freedom, the traumatizing realization that we are alone, atomized individuals in a vast universe. We explored how that existential terror breeds the authoritarian personality, creating the pseudo-conservative who longs to destroy democratic complexity in order to install a simple strongman.
Right.
We saw how this exact same psychological dynamic plays out in the modern office through the corporate hero trap, where CEOs are treated as unquestionable saviors until the groupthink collapses the company. And we looked at the final, quiet surrender, outsourcing our autonomy to the black box of artificial intelligence.
The powerful thread connecting all of these phenomena is the deeply human, deeply flawed desire to escape the anxiety of choice. But as the combined weight of all our sources makes clear, the only true, lasting cure for the anxiety freedom is the courage to actively, bravely participate in it.
Exactly. And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, pulling everything we've talked about together into your daily life.
Yeah.
Think about the physical and digital architecture of our modern society. It is almost entirely built around the pursuit of absolute, frictionless convenience.
Yeah. Everything is on demand.
We want one-click shopping. We want frictionless, infinite scroll media. We want algorithms that smoothly and quietly tell us what to watch, what to buy, who to date, and what to think. We worship convenience.
We do.
But if convenience, by its very nature, demands that we surrender our agency and our decision-making to an external system, does true freedom in the 21st century actually require us to intentionally seek out discomfort? Does being a free human being today mean actively choosing friction, difficulty, and ambiguity over the easy, algorithmically generated path? If you want to avoid driving your car into the lake, maybe you have to be willing to do the hard work of turning off the GPS and learning to read the map yourself.
It's a challenging, necessary thought. True autonomy requires the effort of friction.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take that friction with you this week. Until next time, keep questioning.